BBC World News America. Reporting from Washington, I'm Rajini Vaidyanathan. Hurricane Florence is pounding the Carolina coast with powerful winds and devastating rains. We're on the scene with the latest.
The hurricane has claimed at least 4 lives. Here in North Carolina, flooding is the greatest risk as the water levels rise.
Meanwhile, in the northern Philippines, residents are being evacuated as Super Typhoon Manco makes landfall. More than 5 million people are in the storm's path. And Donald Trump's former campaign manager Paul Manafort makes a plea deal to avoid a second trial. It includes cooperating with Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller. Welcome to our viewers on public television in America and around the globe. Hurricane Florence has arrived in full force. The storm's currently battering the state of North Carolina with torrential rainfall and powerful winds. Rescue efforts are underway in communities that have been completely shut off and waterways haven't even approached their peak. The BBC's Laura Trevelyan is in Wilmington, North Carolina and has been out in the elements all day.
Well, Rajini, it was a dramatic scene here a little after 7 a.m. this morning as the eye wall of the hurricane landed right here in Wilmington, North Carolina, and there was an eerie green light which denotes the center of the eye wall. I've never seen anything like it, and it has been a dramatic day. As you can see, the weather is still dramatic. A mother and her infant were killed here in Wilmington when a tree fell on their house, and now the greatest threat is from flooding as this huge slow storm just swirls off the coast of the Carolinas and dumps rainfall on us for at least 2 days. Here's my colleague Chris Buckler.
The Carolinas knew what was coming, but they could never fully prepare for the force of Florence. Along this coastline, houses found themselves on the front line for a fierce incoming storm and a surge of water that flooded streets and homes. Despite the many days of warnings, there were people caught out and families who needed to be rescued from their homes.
Pool water, pool water. There you go, there you go.
In New Bern in North Carolina, the emergency services had to move in as people became cut off.
I've never been so terrified in my entire life. It was horrifying. Just wondering what's going on and where the water's going to go and how high it's going to go and how we are going to get out.
In the town of Wilmington, street after street was littered with the debris of this storm. Huge trees, no match for the power of the winds, even though this hurricane had weakened before it reached land. This morning, people gathered to see what was left of their neighborhood.
They kept telling us how bad it would be, and we thought we were prepared, but you just can't be prepared for that. Nothing you can do when a tree falls, you know.
And this storm has already proved to be deadly. A fallen tree near here was responsible for killing a mother and her child.
Hurricane Florence is powerful, slow, and relentless. It's an uninvited brute who doesn't want to leave.
While Florence is here, some families have headed to emergency shelters, places where they know they will be safe.
What are you worried about?
Not having a place to go home to or a job.
All those practical concerns are shared as Florence continues to hover over the Carolinas.
She's wheelchair bound and it's been really rough. I said, God, through Jesus Christ, our Lord, would you please protect our home and everyone else in Wilmington.
Evacuation warnings remain in place as families steel themselves for another night of wind, rain and damage here on Cape Fear.
Well, Laura, the winds weren't as fierce as predicted, but it's the rains that seem to be causing the huge problems, just judging by where you are. What's happening where you are in Wilmington?
Well, that's right, Rajini. Hurricane Florence has now been downgraded. She's a tropical storm, but that's misleading in the sense that she still poses a huge threat because she's so huge and sprawling. She's as wide as the Carolinas, and she's so slow. She's going practically at walking pace at 5 miles an hour. And she's dumping this rainfall all over North Carolina, South Carolina, creating a flooding threat that goes all the way from Virginia, potentially to Georgia. And I'm standing talking to you next to the Cape Fear River, which has broken its banks. And we're told that it won't even crest that river until Tuesday. So there is a risk of catastrophic flooding to people's homes well into next week, Rajini.
And Laura, we saw in Chris's report just then some of the rescue efforts across the state. How challenging are the rains for people who are trying to rescue others?
Well, it's very challenging, and in fact the Cajun Navy have come here. They first made their name in Hurricane Katrina. Volunteers who bring their own boats here and turn out to rescue people, and they're already in operation alongside the state-level effort. So yes, these are immensely challenging conditions. Mother Nature has produced this monster of a storm, and the fact that the rain is going to continue for the next few days, it doesn't make anything any easier at all. So this storm, which potentially could cause billions of dollars worth of damage, is now heading towards South Carolina, and the fear is that it will do its worst there too.
And very briefly, Laura, you say it's going to be another few days of this storm. What are the knock-on effects going on in the next days and weeks?
Well, the worry is that the inland flooding will become worse, Rajini. Obviously, the storm came ashore at the coast, but hurricanes are like bulldozers. They just push water inland, and because this one is hanging around and lingering like an uninvited guest, the worst house guest ever, what you're seeing is more and more, what you will see is more and more inland flooding, rivers in places where people just don't expect their houses to flood, and that's what they now have to beware of.
Laura Trevelyan, thanks very much. I hope you can get in the dry soon. Now, in the Pacific, another storm is also wreaking havoc. Typhoon Manco's made landfall in the northern Philippines with winds of more than 200 kilometres an hour. It's forecast to bring powerful waves and torrential rain, causing flooding and landslides, which could impact as many as 5 million people. Well, the BBC's Howard Johnson has the latest from there.
Within the last few hours, Typhoon Manco has made landfall on the northern tip of the main island of Luzon. 5 million people are thought to be in the path of this potentially deadly storm. Authorities had already urged thousands of people to move inland from vulnerable coastal areas. In nearby Santa Ana, local officials aren't taking any chances. This village school has been turned into an emergency shelter.
There is a tendency for landslides in this area in the past, so a village council has advised them to get out early.
On the road out of Cagayan province, we passed farmers anxious to do what they can to salvage their harvest. The Philippines endures about 20 typhoons and storms each year. Manco is the strongest storm of 2018 so far. It's more than 500 miles in diameter with sustained winds of over 160 miles an hour.
We're around 100 miles away from where this storm is about to hit hardest. Already the winds are up and it's been raining heavily. As you can see, most people have heeded the warning to stay inside and wait for this potentially devastating typhoon to pass.
Howard Johnson, BBC News, Santiago.
Well, for more on both storms, I spoke a brief while ago with Dr. Marshall Shepard, a former NASA scientist who's now a meteorologist at the University of Georgia. Dr. Marshall Shepard, it's great to have you with us. We've seen the devastation in the Carolinas. Is the worst over now?
I do not think the worst is over. I think the worst is over in terms of the wind. But as I've talked about on social media and even written about today in Forbes, this is a Phase A and a Phase B storm. So we're now in Phase B. We saw the wind. We're still seeing the storm surge. But then we're going to see the storm, as it's stalling out, produce quite a bit of rainfall. And if we think back to 2017 with Hurricane Harvey, we're seeing almost a replay because the storm's just sitting there dumping rain, and we could see feet of rain, 1, 2, even 3 feet of rain in some parts of the Carolinas.
And how does so much rain, rain that's worth many months, get dumped in such a short number of days in this situation?
It's quite astounding how these storms can produce so much rainfall, but one of the things that we've known for many decades now in the scientific literature, the deadliest part of a hurricane is always the water, whether we're talking about the storm surge or the inland freshwater flooding from rainfall. We've seen it time and time again. Even this region has seen it with Hurricane Floyd and Matthew. So that is why it's so important to de-emphasize the category. I heard people saying, oh, it went from Category 4 to Category 2, it's not as bad. That is not the case. This storm was huge, and now that it's stalled and sitting there, that's a recipe for a flooding disaster.
And in the longer term, what else could be the impact? Some people raising concerns about mudslides potentially in the coming weeks and days.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things. I think we're going to see sustained rainfall, which is going to lead to trees falling on power lines. So I know that there are already 500,000 people or more without power in that region already. So as those trees fall, you have power outages potentially lasting for days. As the storm moves further inland, unlike Houston and Harvey, North Carolina and South Carolina have mountainous terrain. So I could see mudslides, perhaps in the high elevated terrains. I could see landslides, and even in some of the urban areas around the Carolinas, urban and flash flooding as well. So this is a long-term Phase A, Phase B event, and Phase B is really just getting started.
And let's move to the Pacific. A typhoon expected in the Philippines. I've covered a typhoon in the Philippines before. I've seen the devastation that can result. What are we expecting when it comes to this typhoon?
We're talking 160 plus mile per hour winds. And if you've seen the satellite imagery of this typhoon, the eye of that storm is tremendous. And so we're certainly keeping an eye on that part of the globe as well, because the tropics are just not active in the Atlantic. They're active across the globe. And we're thinking and watching for our colleagues and friends and citizens over in the Philippines.
Dr. Marshall Shepherd, thanks for joining us. Now let's take a look at some of the day's other news. A series of gas explosions have set fire to dozens of homes in Massachusetts. At least one person has died and more than 10 have been injured. The blast took place in 3 towns north of Boston and are thought to have been caused by the rupture of an overpressurized gas line. President Trump's reportedly instructed his aides to proceed with the 3rd round of tariffs on about $200 billion of Chinese products. Mr. Trump's decision comes despite the attempt from the US Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin to restart talks with China and resolve the trade war. Now, staying with Donald Trump, and the president's former campaign chairman Paul Manafort will cooperate with Robert Mueller's probe into Russian meddling during the 2016 election. It's a dramatic turnaround after months of refusing to assist the special counsel, but the president's team maintains it has nothing to do with him or his campaign. Well, the BBC's John Sopel joined me a brief time ago from the White House. John, what is the significance of this plea deal to the wider Russia investigation?
Well, Paul Manafort was the campaign manager in the months leading up to the election, when the Republican National Committee changed its policy towards Russia, when there was that meeting that took place in Trump Tower between Paul Manafort, Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, and a Russian lawyer with very close links to the Kremlin, promising dirt on Hillary Clinton. Now, as part of this plea deal that has been arranged today, Paul Manafort has agreed that he will give interviews on any and all matters to which the government deems relevant. In other words, Robert Mueller has got a wristband now which has access all areas written on it. He can go wherever he likes in his questioning of Paul Manafort. That is a big change from the last 24 hours.
And John, Paul Manafort isn't the only former member of staff working for Donald Trump to now cooperate with Robert Mueller. What trouble could the president potentially be in?
Well, what you've got now is that we haven't really known what Robert Mueller has been doing. He's been on the outer edges of the Trump circle with kind of people that no one had ever heard of. But gradually, he's moving closer and closer. So not only have you got Manafort, the former campaign chairman, now helping the Mueller investigation, you have got Trump's former personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, helping. You have got the chief financial officer of the Trump organization apparently helping in a limited degree. You've got the publisher of the National Enquirer, who had all sorts of information helping with the Mueller investigation. And so on all sorts of levels, I would guess that the anxiety levels in the White House are increasing and Donald Trump's mood darkening.
Never a dull day in Washington. John Sopel, thanks very much for joining us. You're watching BBC World News America. Still to come on tonight's programme. 10 years after the Lehman Brothers crash, we go to a Florida suburb to see what the lasting impact has been of the financial crisis.
Synergies based on mutual trust. Unlock vast opportunities to enhance connectivity, supporting infrastructure, to develop maritime potential, to discover exotic taste, to cherish the beauty of nature, and to witness creativities inspired by multicultural spirit. Together we will anchor the economic opportunities of our lifetime. Come and invest in Indonesia.
Africa, a land of limitless talent.
You have architects and engineers and project managers, so it's a whole ecosystem.
Where a growing, ambitious middle class.
African domestic demand will more than triple in the next 6 years.
That used to be a mangrove swamp.
It's turning the continent into a 21st century powerhouse.
Wearing Made in Nigeria wasn't very cool. Now it's all about Made in Nigeria.
Talking Business Africa on BBC World News.
Which stories matter this week? Who's shaping the news around the world? If you're the President of the United States, then your words move markets. The whole world is confused right now with what he's going to do.
Find out on Newsnight. Are you saying there is literally only one way of leaving the European Union? There are no choices whatsoever.
Documentary, analysis and interviews. Is it possible that your commanders don't always know how many civilians are in the houses around about? On BBC World News.
Now let's return to our coverage of Hurricane Florence. Now we've obviously seen the impact on the ground, but a team of scientists is tasked with flying into this storm to gather vital information. It's a terrifying task, but the data gives a much better idea of where the storm's heading and how ferocious it will be. The BBC's Neda Tawfik went up with the hurricane hunters and filed this report.
Another mission complete, but there's no time to waste to ready the next. With millions vulnerable to the force of Florence, these hurricane hunters have been flying round the clock, right into the eye of the storm. The team of pilots and scientists from the U.S. Air Force Reserve will pass through Florence 5 times during the exhaustive 8-hour mission, dropping sensors to collect the temperature, pressure, and wind speed of the storm. This cargo plane, with its cutting-edge technology, is essentially a laboratory with wings. An hour after takeoff, we enter the storm.
We're flying through Hurricane Florence now, and you can see that there is zero visibility. On top of that, we are hitting winds of up to 100 miles per hour. Now, these pilots are experienced with flying in dangerous situations. They know that the information they collect will be critical to determining the storm's next move.
And I'll release one in the eye wall, the eye, and the other eye wall on the way out as well.
Sensors get dropped at specific points in the storm.
All right, so he gave me the command, so I'm launching it.
Oh, that was the drop. That was that sound, that drop.
So that was
the capsule being released from the plane.
The information gets sent back to the National Hurricane Center every 10 minutes. It's used to constantly update the storm model and can improve forecasts by 20%. When we reach the eye of the storm, it is clouded over. Hurricane Florence has been weakening, but it's no less destructive.
So we're out here like boots on the ground, eyes on the scene. I've had other storms I've gone through where on satellite it looked like a tropical storm, but in actuality when you got into the storm, all the winds and the data turned it into a Category 2 hurricane.
After a long day, they turn for home in darkness. On the ground, the next team of hurricane hunters prepared their journey back into the storm. Neda Tawfiq, BBC News in South Carolina.
Now that Neda is thankfully back on safe ground, we can check in with her to see how conditions are where she is, which is Charleston, South Carolina. Neda, watching you go up in that hurricane plane, I was terrified for you. What was it like going there?
Well, Rajini, I have to say you really do appreciate all of the work that goes into updating those forecasts for the hurricanes. And two things that really struck me on the ride. First was just on the way to the storm when there was some visibility and we weren't yet in the clouds, seeing the strength of the waves below. One of the meteorologists told me, you know, it may not look like it, but those waves are the size of houses. And it was just really rough conditions out there. And then when we finally did go through Hurricane Florence's outer bands and through the eye wall, of course, the fact that there was no visibility was quite nerve-wracking, but you then realize that the pilots are trained for this. They know what they're doing, and in fact, on their outfits, their uniforms, they carry badges with the number of pennies they have, and that means penetrations into hurricanes, and they had quite a few racked up, so we knew we were in good hands.
So Neda, where you are is a real contrast to where we spoke to Laura Trevelyan earlier. It looks very dry where you are. Is Charleston safe from the worst?
Well, we're here on the Battery, and the storm is approaching, and we will feel the effects over the next 2 days. But, you know, speaking to people here who are walking up and down this promenade, they say the low country is used to flooding. And so even though we're expected to get about 4 to 6 inches of rain over the next 2 days, they're very used to flooding. They say it happens with a simple thunderstorm. And so they're really taking this in stride. And in fact, many here just didn't listen to that mandatory evacuation. Now, if you do go further into the commercial downtown area, a lot of those shops are boarded up. They really did heed those warnings, and they're losing a lot of businesses. So we did hear from some who complained that this was done a bit too early, but of course the governor warning that this is still a dangerous storm and they didn't want to take any lives for granted.
Neda Tawfiq, you're a braver woman than I am. Thanks for joining us. Well, all this week we've been marking 10 years since the collapse of Lehman Brothers and the global economic crisis which followed. For millions of people, life was never the same. As banking systems teetered, markets plunged and jobs were lost. The BBC's Nick Bryant's been to the affluent suburb of Fort Myers in Florida to see what the lasting impact there was.
Fort Myers in Florida was once the home of the American dream, but in 2008 it was dubbed the ground zero of the Great Recession. Affluent dream suburbs where more than 40% of properties were repossessed.
Everything in this area was totally in foreclosure.
Estate agent Mark Joseph witnessed the misery of the crash, saw the tears of people who not only lost their homes, but also their faith in the economic promise of America.
That whole dream of working hard and actually reaping the benefits of working hard, I think for me, the American dream was that wasn't reality. The dream would have been I would have been retired 10 years ago.
Not so many Americans own property anymore. A child's chance of earning more than their parents has plunged from 90% after the war to just 50%. And as Lynn Williams and her daughter Emma will tell you, the children of the financial crisis are finding it harder to leave home.
I have 2 jobs plus an internship, and I'm probably getting about 4 to 6 hours of sleep.
Maybe 3.
Maybe 3 some nights. Yeah, it depends on like when I get off of work, but.
And you still can't afford to move out?
No.
It's not any longer that you can go and get a degree and automatically get a well-paying job. It's just not how it runs anymore in this country.
What we didn't anticipate 10 years ago was how the financial earthquake would upend the American political landscape, how voters like Brenda Biddle, who lost 2 luxury homes, would become Donald Trump's forgotten people.
I had a really horrible 8 years of just trying to get back on my feet. For a couple of years, it was hard to feed my children, to be honest with you, especially when I did become single.
And so your feeling when Donald Trump came along?
Excitement. I mean, I think hope was instant in day one. I think everybody was lifted.
Much of the US economy has rebounded. Unemployment is at an 18-year low. But even in the Sunshine State, 2008 continues to cast long shadows, and its sprawling suburbs are no longer such a symbol of American upward mobility. Nick Bryant, BBC News, Florida.
Well, that's it for the programme. You can find all the latest on the hurricane and the typhoon on our website. I'm Rajini Vaidyanathan. Thanks for watching World News America.